That tree witnessed the birth of a nation. Its roots were in the ground when Washington crossed the Delaware, when Jefferson put quill to parchment. Men whose faces are carved into mountains once carved their initials into its bark. And Betty, the HOA president, killed it with a chainsaw she bought on Facebook Marketplace because acorns were denting the hood of her Lexus. It took her 4 hours. It took that tree 4 centuries. That tree was a living monument. 400 years of American history reduced to sawdust in a single morning. But this wasn't an accident of nature or a utility company's mistake. It was a deliberate, legal act carried out by the president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association because a few falling acorns were inconveniencing her. The question isn't just how someone could do this. It's how our laws allowed her to get away with it. This is the story of the loophole that let a suburban tyrant erase a piece of American heritage, and the neighbors determined to make sure the founding fathers' tree wasn't forgotten. The tree stood in Oakwood Estates, a subdivision in Fairfax County, Virginia, carved out of what was once a colonial land grant from the King of England. The neighborhood was built in the 1990s around it, literally. The developers bent the streets, shrunk the cul-de-sacs, and left a jagged lot of common ground just to keep this white oak standing. It was the centerpiece of the community, a living landmark so massive its branches shaded 5 houses at once. Its trunk measured nearly 9 feet across, and core samples taken by dendrochronologists from the University of Virginia confirmed it sprouted around 1623. That's 3 years after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. For decades, the tree was a point of pride. The HOA's own newsletters called it the founding oak, claiming George Washington had rested beneath it while surveying the lands west of the Potomac. Local historians argued about the details, but the property records were ironclad. The tree was there when this patch of Virginia was still a dense hardwood forest, long before the first brick was ever laid. And the man who knew every inch of that history was Andrew Keller, a retired social studies teacher who had lived in the house directly across the common lawn for 27 years. He'd spent his retirement cataloging the tree's story, photographing its seasonal changes, and leading educational walks for the neighborhood kids. He even wrote a monograph for the County Historical Society, titled A Witness to the Republic, tracing the tree's life against the timeline of American history. But none of that mattered to Betty Winslow. Betty had moved into Oakwood Estates 3 years ago, buying the largest house on the cul-de-sac with a 6-car brick driveway and a Lexus SUV she treated like a museum piece. She retired early after a career in commercial real estate and quickly set her sights on the HOA board. Within 18 months, she was president. Her campaign platform was simple: modernize the community, raise property values, and enforce the covenants down to the letter. The first thing she did was issue violation notices for mailbox colors that didn't match the approved beige palette. The second thing she did was declare war on the founding oak. The official complaint, filed in the HOA board minutes on April 12th, cited excessive acorn debris causing damage to vehicles and a trip hazard on the sidewalk. Betty claimed a falling acorn had dented the hood of her Lexus, and she submitted repair estimates for $900 in paintless dent removal. She also included photographs of cracked acorns littering the pavement, describing them as a public safety risk. The board, stacked with 3 of her closest friends, voted 3-1 to classify the tree as a nuisance under Article 7 of the CC&RS. That clause, buried in legal jargon, gave the Architectural Review Committee the power to order the removal of any landscaping element deemed hazardous or detrimental to property values. It was a loophole the original developer had added for overgrown shrubs and dead bushes, never imagining someone would use it to execute a 400-year-old oak. Andrew Keller fought back immediately. He gathered signatures from 47 neighbors demanding a special board meeting. He filed a formal appeal with the county's Urban Forestry Division, which had previously designated the tree as a heritage specimen, meaning its removal required a permit and a public hearing. For a brief moment, it seemed like the system would work. A county arborist inspected the oak on May 2nd and issued a report stating the tree was in excellent health, structurally sound, and posed no risk to public safety. The permit was denied. Andrew sent the report to the board with a letter citing the county's Heritage Tree Ordinance, which carried fines of up to $10,000 for unauthorized removal. Betty's response was to find a new loophole. She hired a private arborist who submitted a contradictory report, claiming the tree had internal decay that made it vulnerable to a catastrophic limb failure. The HOA's attorney, a man named Robert Travis, whose firm specialized in defending developer interests, argued that the CC&RS granted the association exclusive authority over landscaping decisions on common ground, superseding county regulations. It was a novel legal theory, and it had never been tested in Virginia courts, but that didn't matter. The board didn't need a court order. They just needed the votes. On the morning of May 17th, a flatbed truck carrying a wood chipper and two men from Northern Virginia tree removal pulled into the cul-de-sac at 6 a.m. Betty stood on her driveway, coffee in hand, watching like a supervisor at a demolition site. Andrew heard the chainsaw from his kitchen and ran outside still in his pajamas. He saw the first limb fall, a branch as thick as a telephone pole that had stretched toward the sunrise for 3 centuries. He screamed at the crew to stop, waving the county arborist's report. One of the workers hesitated, but Betty walked over, calmly unfolded a copy of the HOA board resolution and pointed to the signature line. The crew foreman shrugged. He had a contract. He had a waiver. He fired up the chainsaw again. It took 4 hours to bring the entire tree down. By 7 a.m., neighbors were gathered on the lawn, some filming with their phones, others crying. Someone called the police, and a Fairfax County officer arrived at 8:15. He looked at the stump, looked at the resolution, and told the crowd it was a civil matter. There was nothing he could do. By 10 a.m., the founding oak was nothing but a flat disc of wood, its rings radiating outward like a fingerprint of American history. The crew fed the limbs into the chipper, and Betty went back inside to make herself a second cup of coffee. Andrew stood at the edge of the grass, holding his monograph in one hand and the denied county permit in the other. He had done everything right. He'd followed every rule, appealed through every channel, and it hadn't mattered because a single woman with a grudge and a legal loophole had more power than 4 centuries of living history. But what he didn't know yet, what Betty couldn't have anticipated, was that cutting down the tree was not the end of this fight. It was only the beginning. Because inside the rings of that oak was a secret that Betty's chainsaw had just exposed to the world, and Andrew was the only person who knew what to look for. The first thing Andrew noticed was the iron spike. The tree removal crew had stacked the largest sections of trunk on a trailer, planning to haul them to a lumber mill that paid by the board foot for old-growth oak. But as they rolled one massive round onto the truck bed, a chunk of heartwood broke away and something metallic clattered onto the pavement. The foreman kicked it aside like a piece of scrap. Andrew walked over and picked it up. It was a hand-forged iron spike, about 8 inches long, corroded but unmistakably man-made. He turned it over in his palm and felt his breath catch. The spike was square-headed, tapered, and stamped with a ghost of a mark he recognized from decades of teaching Virginia history. It was a colonial surveyor's pin, the kind used in the 1700s to mark property boundaries, and it had been driven into the center of the founding oak. Andrew knew what that meant. In early American land surveying, witness trees were used as permanent markers for corners and boundary lines. The surveyor would sink an iron rod or spike into the tree, and the tree would grow around it, preserving the exact location of the property line for centuries. The fact that this spike was embedded in the oldest tree in Oakwood Estates suggested something staggering. The founding oak wasn't just a historic landmark. It was an active legal monument, marking a boundary that predated the subdivision, the county, and possibly even the Commonwealth of Virginia's modern borders. He took the spike home, photographed it from every angle, and began digging through the Fairfax County land records. What he found made his hands shake. The original patent for the land was granted in 1692 by the British Crown to a man named Ephraim Brock, a tobacco planter who had arrived from England with a royal charter. The grant described a tract of 800 acres, bounded on the south by a creek, on the west by a rock outcropping, and on the east by a great white oak whereon a spike of iron is set fast. That tree was the eastern corner of the Brock Grant. And according to Virginia law, a surviving monument, a physical boundary marker, held legal precedence over written descriptions, survey maps, and modern deeds. If that spike was authentic, then the legal boundary lines of every property in Oakwood Estates might still be attached to a 300-year-old land grant that had never been properly extinguished. Andrew called a friend from his teaching days, a historian named Dr. Helen Murren, who specialized in colonial land disputes at William and Mary. She agreed to examine the spike and the records. Within 48 hours, she called him back with news that upended everything. She had cross-referenced the Brock Grant with a chain of title that showed the land was inherited by a daughter who married into the Fairfax family, the very family the county was named for. Lord Fairfax, the largest landowner in colonial Virginia, had owned 5 million acres, and his estate had been the subject of a 200-year legal battle that reached the Supreme Court twice. According to Helen's research, the Brock parcel was never formally purchased from the Fairfax heirs. It was simply absorbed into the public domain after the American Revolution under a dubious claim of forfeiture. But a 1796 Supreme Court ruling in Fairfax versus Hunter's lessee had established that certain Fairfax land claims remained valid despite the Revolution. That ruling opened the door for descendants to reclaim property. Andrew stared at the copy of the old ruling. If his chain of research held up, the entire subdivision, all 64 houses, the clubhouse, the pool, and the road, might still legally belong to the Fairfax estate. And Betty Winslow had just destroyed the primary physical evidence of the boundary, the witness tree, without authorization, potentially exposing the HOA to a quiet title action that could cost millions. But what made it even more explosive was that the Fairfax heirs still existed. Helen had located a direct descendant, a man named Thomas Fairfax IX, living in a modest townhouse in Alexandria. He was a retired architect, completely unaware that his family's 3-century claim to the land might still be viable. When Andrew called him, Thomas listened quietly for 10 minutes and then said 3 words that changed everything. "I have the papers." Thomas had inherited a trunk of documents from his great-grandfather, including original land grants, correspondence from Thomas Lord Fairfax, and a survey map from 1745 that clearly showed the Brock parcel and the witness oak. The map lined up perfectly with the modern boundaries of Oakwood Estates. The spike Andrew found was itemized in a 1752 surveyor's manifest. The evidence was overwhelming, but here's where the story took a darker turn. Before Andrew could take any legal action, Betty Winslow found out what he was doing. One of the HOA board members lived next door to Andrew and had overheard his phone conversations. The board immediately convened an emergency executive session, and the next morning, Andrew received a letter from the HOA attorney, Robert Travis. The letter accused him of trespassing on common ground, theft of association property, the iron spike, and spreading false claims intended to devalue neighborhood homes. It demanded that he return the spike within 72 hours or face a lawsuit for conversion and slander of title. The letter threatened to file a lien against his house for the HOA's legal fees. Andrew called Thomas Fairfax, who immediately retained a property rights attorney, a fierce litigator named Sarah Okonkwo, who specialized in ancient land claims. Sarah reviewed the documents and issued a stunning response. She filed a notice of lis pendens against the entire Oakwood Estates development, a legal action that clouded the title of every single property in the subdivision. Buyers could no longer get title insurance. Sellers couldn't close. The housing market in Oakwood Estates froze overnight. Betty Winslow's house, worth $800,000, was suddenly unsellable, and it was all because of an iron spike she'd called a piece of scrap. The neighborhood erupted. Angry homeowners confronted Betty at the next board meeting, demanding answers. She insisted the claim was frivolous, that the HOA's insurance would handle it. But the insurance company soon disclaimed coverage, citing a policy exclusion for title defects. The HOA was on its own, bleeding legal fees and drowning in panic. Andrew, meanwhile, had become a local hero. The story leaked to the Washington Post, and a front-page article headlined "A 4-century-old tree and the battle for a subdivision" made national news. Patricia Langford, a reporter with a knack for exposing corruption, began digging into Betty Winslow's background. What she found turned the entire conflict from a property dispute into something far more sinister. It turned out Betty had a pattern. Before moving to Oakwood Estates, she had served as an HOA president in 2 other Virginia communities. In both, historic trees had been removed under suspicious circumstances, always followed by rezoning proposals or land sales to developers. In one case, a 250-year-old sycamore on common ground was cut down, and 6 months later, a developer bought the adjacent lot and built a high-density condo complex. Betty had purchased that lot from the HOA for a fraction of its value before the rezoning. She had a financial interest. The pattern was unmistakable. She wasn't just an overzealous board member. She was a land speculator using HOAs as a vehicle to clear obstacles for development deals. Patricia's investigation uncovered emails between Betty and a commercial real estate developer named Marcus Green, who had been eyeing the Oakwood Estates common ground for a strip mall for years. The founding oak was protected by county heritage status, making the land undevelopable. Removing the tree would open the door to a commercial rezoning that could net Betty and her partners millions. The dented hood of her Lexus was a pretext, a manufactured complaint to trigger the CC&R loophole and circumvent the county's protections. And now that Andrew's discovery had tied the land to a colonial title claim, the entire scheme was unraveling in full public view. But as Andrew and Thomas Fairfax prepared their case, they uncovered one final twist that changed everything again. The spike was real. The boundary was legitimate. But buried in the Fairfax family archives was a will from 1781 that specifically bequeathed the Brock parcel to a freed African-American family that had served the Fairfax estate for generations. The Fairfax heirs didn't own the land at all. It belonged to the descendants of the Brooks family, a lineage of free black Virginians who had been cheated out of their inheritance for 240 years. And among those descendants, living quietly in Richmond, was a woman named Elena Brooks, who had been waiting her entire life for someone to find the proof. Elena Brooks was 72 years old when she got the call. She lived in a small brick house in Richmond's historic Jackson Ward, a neighborhood built by freed black families after the Civil War. Her grandfather had told her stories since she was a child, stories about a great oak tree that marked the land her ancestors had been promised, a tree with an iron spike driven into its heart. She'd spent decades searching county records, historical societies, and genealogical archives, finding fragments but never the key. The will existed in the Fairfax family papers, but the tree had always been missing, until Andrew Keller held up a corroded spike on the local news and said the words "founding oak." Elena contacted Sarah Okonkwo within hours. She brought her own archive, a leather-bound journal kept by her great-great-great-grandfather, Moses Brooks, a free black blacksmith who had worked for the Fairfax estate. The journal described how Lord Fairfax had granted the Brock parcel to Moses and his wife Sarah in gratitude for loyal service during the Revolution, a written promise of land and freedom. But after Lord Fairfax died in 1781, his white relatives contested the will. They burned the original deed, destroyed the surveyor's markers, and drove the Brooks family off the land at gunpoint. Moses wrote that he had forged an iron spike and secretly embedded it into the witness oak as a record of the true boundary. "So long as the oak stands," he wrote, "our claim shall never be buried." For 240 years the oak stood, and now it was gone. But Betty Winslow had made a fatal miscalculation. She thought she was removing a tree. In truth, she had unearthed the only surviving physical evidence of a crime that predated the United States itself. The story exploded. Patricia Langford's Washington Post article had already made national headlines, but the Brooks family revelation transformed it into a cultural reckoning. Civil rights organizations, historic preservation groups, and law professors descended on Oakwood Estates. The Congressional Black Caucus issued a statement calling for a federal investigation into the destruction of a potential national heritage site. The Virginia Attorney General's office opened a civil rights inquiry, examining whether the HOA had specifically targeted a landmark tied to African American history. And then the forensic reports landed like a bomb. Sarah Okonkwo had commissioned a metallurgical analysis of the iron spike from a lab at the University of Richmond. The results were stunning. The iron was smelted in a furnace that matched records from the Rappahannock Forge, a foundry that supplied George Washington's army during the Revolution and later fabricated survey equipment for the Fairfax estate. But more significantly, the lab discovered a series of tiny, deliberate scratches on the spike's shaft, a message etched in an 18th-century code used by enslaved people and free blacks to mark safe routes on the Underground Railroad. When decoded, the scratches read, "M. Brooks, free man, this land is our forever." That code, that artifact, transformed the spike from a boundary marker into a historic treasure. The Smithsonian called. The National Museum of African American History and Culture expressed interest in acquiring it. Suddenly, Betty Winslow's chainsaw had not just felled a tree. She had exposed a deliberate conspiracy to erase black land ownership that had persisted from the colonial era right through to the modern HOA. But Betty wasn't finished. She still had leverage. The HOA attorney, Robert Travis, filed an emergency motion in Fairfax County Circuit Court, arguing that even if the Brooks claim was valid, it had been extinguished by 2 centuries of adverse possession. The homeowners, he argued, had built their lives in good faith. They couldn't be punished for crimes committed before their grandparents were born. And he raised a darker argument that Elena Brooks couldn't prove continuous possession because her family had been violently chased off the land in 1782. That was a bar to her claim under Virginia statute. Andrew was furious. He stood at the next community meeting, held in the high school gymnasium because so many residents showed up, and pleaded with his neighbors. "This isn't about property values anymore," he said. "It's about whether we're going to correct a wrong that's older than the Constitution." He held up the iron spike, now encased in a protective evidence box. "This is the original deed. The tree was the courtroom, and Betty Winslow just called all of us as witnesses." The room split down the middle. Some homeowners, terrified of losing their life savings, supported Betty. Others, horrified by the history, demanded the HOA negotiate with Elena Brooks. The board, sensing political suicide, voted to oust Betty as president, but she refused to step down, citing a quorum technicality. She barricaded herself in the HOA office, a small structure next to the community pool, and began shredding documents. Meanwhile, Patricia Langford kept digging. Her investigation revealed that Marcus Green, Betty's developer partner, had a family history that intersected with the story in a chilling way. His great-great-great-grandfather was a judge on the Virginia Circuit Court in 1790 who had ruled against the Brooks family in a trespass case, declaring that free Negroes cannot hold title against white men. That ruling had been cited as precedent for decades, upholding the theft of black-owned land across the South. Marcus Green was quite literally a descendant of the very legal machinery that had stolen Elena's inheritance. And now he was trying to profit from the same land again, using Betty Winslow as his proxy. When this came out, Marcus Green's company issued a hasty statement calling it an unfortunate historical coincidence and withdrew from the development deal. But the damage was done. 3 other developers who had partnered with Green on previous projects were now facing their own lawsuits. The FBI's art crime team, which investigates stolen cultural property, opened a preliminary file. If the iron spike qualified as a historic artifact, its destruction could trigger federal charges. Betty knew the walls were closing in. She made one last desperate move. She filed a defamation suit against Andrew Keller, Elena Brooks, Thomas Fairfax, and the Washington Post, seeking $12 million in damages. The lawsuit argued that the entire story was a hoax, that the spike was planted, that the Brooks family's journal was a forgery, and that Andrew and Patricia had conspired to destroy her reputation and crash the housing market. She demanded the spike be surrendered and destroyed. But that was the moment Sarah Okonkwo had been waiting for. She filed a counterclaim under Virginia's anti-SLAPP statute, designed to stop lawsuits meant to silence public participation. And she attached a new piece of evidence, a 1785 letter from the Fairfax estate's executor, discovered in the Library of Congress archives, that explicitly acknowledged the Brooks family's ownership and urged a settlement that was never paid. The letter had been misfiled for centuries, discovered just days earlier by a research librarian who heard about the case on NPR. With that letter, the Brooks claim became nearly unassailable. The HOA's title insurance collapsed entirely. Homeowners began to panic sell to speculators at 50 cents on the dollar. The subdivision descended into chaos. And in the middle of it all, on a cold November morning, the Fairfax County Circuit Court Judge, Myra Henderson, issued the ruling everyone was waiting for. She had ordered a full forensic analysis of the stump itself, the remaining wood and roots, to determine if the tree's age and the spike's placement were consistent with the historical records. The arborist's report was due on Friday. If it confirmed the tree was indeed the witness oak, the quiet title case would proceed to trial, and Alina Brooks would have a legal path to reclaim every square inch of Oakwood Estates. Betty Winslow would face not just financial ruin, but potential prison time for fraud, trespass, and destruction of a historic landmark. But when the arborist's report finally arrived, it contained a discovery that none of the attorneys had anticipated. Something else was buried in the heartwood of that stump, something that had nothing to do with spikes, boundaries, or land grants. It was a small lead box, corroded but intact, sealed with wax. And inside that box was a folded document, written on parchment, that predated the Revolution itself, a document that would force the United States government to intervene directly in the case of the founding oak. The lead box was barely larger than a deck of cards, its surface pitted and green with age. The arborist who found it, a man named Dr. Samuel Cho, had been using a fine-toothed saw to extract a cross-section of the stump when the blade struck metal. He stopped immediately, photographed the find, and called the county sheriff. Within hours, the box was in a climate-controlled evidence locker, and the Fairfax County Commonwealth's attorney had convened an emergency meeting with federal authorities. When the contents were finally revealed under the supervision of a forensic archivist from the National Archives, the room fell silent. Inside was a vellum document, folded into thirds, sealed with the wax stamp of King Charles II. It was dated 1677, and it was a treaty, not with a landowner, not with a colonial governor, but with the Pamunkey Indian Nation. The treaty, long thought lost to history, established the boundary between the Virginia colony and Pamunkey tribal lands. It specified a line running from the Potomac River to the Falls of the James, marked by 8 witness trees. The founding oak was the third marker, designated as the Great White Oak, standing upon the hill overlooking the creek. The treaty was signed by Cokakosk, the Queen of the Pamunkey, and by representatives of the Crown. And buried in the text was a clause that no historian had ever verified until now. In the event of the line's dissolution, the land within 1 mile of each witness tree would revert to the sovereign jurisdiction of the Pamunkey Nation in perpetuity. That clause had never been triggered because no one had ever cut down a witness tree. Until Betty Winslow. The discovery hit Washington like a thunderclap. The Department of the Interior dispatched a legal team overnight. The Bureau of Indian Affairs formally notified Fairfax County that any attempt to transfer or develop the Oakwood Estates property would violate federal treaty law, which supersedes all state and local ordinances under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. The entire subdivision, all 47 acres of it, was now under a cloud of federal title review. The Pamunkey Tribal Council, which had been fighting for federal recognition of its land claims for decades, immediately filed a motion to intervene in the Virginia court case. Their attorney, a brilliant young lawyer named Naomi Litlewing, argued that the destruction of the witness tree was not just a property crime, but a violation of the nation's oldest ratified treaty, a federal offense carrying penalties of up to 20 years in prison. Betty Winslow's defamation lawsuit evaporated overnight. Robert Travis, the HOA attorney, quietly filed a motion to withdraw as counsel, citing a conflict of interest that he refused to explain. The FBI art crime team, which had been circling, took over the investigation from local authorities. They executed a search warrant on Betty's home and found more than the shredded documents from the HOA office. They found a safe containing correspondence with Marcus Green, detailing a plan to exploit the CC&R loophole to remove protected trees on multiple properties, not just in Oakwood Estates, but in 3 other historic subdivisions across Virginia. They also found a set of schematics for a proposed shopping center that would have required the destruction of 2 more century-old trees, one of which was under the protection of a different federal landmark designation. Betty had been systematically dismantling natural barriers to development, and the founding oak was just one casualty in a larger corporate land grab. In a press conference that drew national media, the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia announced a multi-count indictment against Betty Winslow, Marcus Green, and 2 other co-conspirators. The charges included conspiracy to commit wire fraud, destruction of a federal landmark, and violation of the 1677 Treaty of Middle Plantation. If convicted on all counts, Betty faced a maximum of 35 years in federal prison. She was taken into custody that afternoon, her white linen suit exchanged for an orange jumpsuit, her Botox-frozen face finally registering something genuine, terror. But the treaty's revelation didn't just destroy Betty. It reshaped the entire legal landscape for the Brooks family. The Pamunkey Nation, after centuries of displacement and broken promises, now had a stake in the outcome that dovetailed with Elena's claim. Naomi Litluing and Sarah Okonkwo formed an unprecedented legal alliance. They argued that the Brooks family's inheritance, the specific parcel granted by Lord Fairfax, fell within the 1-mile reversion zone of the witness tree. Under the treaty, the land belonged to the Pamunkey, but they could, through tribal sovereignty, recognize and honor the Brooks grant as a valid pre-existing right. It was a legal strategy that no one had ever attempted, blending colonial land grants with native treaty law. If successful, it would recognize both the Pamunkey Nation's territorial integrity and Elena Brooks's inheritance, creating a shared stewardship over the land. Judge Myra Henderson, faced with the most complex property case in Virginia history, scheduled a landmark hearing for December 15th. The courtroom was packed. Elena Brooks sat in the front row, her son and 3 grandchildren beside her. Andrew Keller was there, holding the iron spike in a velvet-lined box, ready to testify. Representatives from the Pamunkey Nation, including Chief Robert Gray, sat in dignified silence. The homeowners of Oakwood Estates, many of them terrified of losing everything, filled the remaining benches. Judge Henderson's ruling was Solomonic. She declared that the 1677 treaty was valid and binding, and that the founding oak was indeed a witness tree whose destruction triggered the reversion clause. However, she further ruled that the Pamunkey Nation's sovereign jurisdiction did not automatically void the deeds of innocent homeowners who had purchased in good faith. Instead, she ordered a 90-day negotiation period between the federal government, the Pamunkey Nation, the Brooks family, and the homeowners' representatives. The goal: to establish a community land trust that would honor the Pamunkey's treaty rights, secure Elena Brooks's inheritance through a permanent family parcel, and protect the homeowners from eviction. The federal government, under the terms of the treaty, was obligated to compensate the Pamunkey Nation for the loss of the land, which would fund a historic preservation district and a cultural center at the site of the founding oak. It was a resolution that no one had expected, but everyone could accept. The tree was gone, but its legacy would create something unprecedented: a cooperative community where tribal sovereignty, black land rights, and suburban homeowners coexisted under a single legal framework. Elena Brooks would receive a deed to 5 acres of the original Brock parcel, including the spot where the oak had stood, plus a settlement of $750,000 from the Federal Compensation Fund. She announced she would build a small museum there, dedicated to the story of the Brooks family and the witness tree. And then, on the morning of the ceremonial groundbreaking for the museum, one of the construction workers noticed something pushing up through the soil near the old stump. It was a green shoot, no taller than a pencil, with tiny oak leaves unfurling toward the sun. The arborist confirmed it, a sapling sprouting from the ancient root system of the founding oak. After 400 years, the tree was coming back. Betty Winslow hadn't killed it after all. She had only set the stage for its resurrection. That sapling now stands in a protected greenhouse on Alina's land, growing stronger every day. It will be transplanted to the center of the new memorial garden, a living witness to a story that began before America and will continue long after we're gone. Sometimes justice doesn't just correct the past, it puts down new roots. That sapling is more than just a branch reaching toward the light. It's proof that what's rooted deep enough can survive a chainsaw, a bulldozer, and 240 years of people trying to erase it. What Betty Winslow never understood is that you can't kill a story that's still growing. The founding oak is gone, but the iron spike is in a museum. The Brooks family has their land. The Pamunkey Nation has a treaty honored for the first time in 3 centuries, and a community of homeowners learned that the price of looking the other way is far higher than the cost of standing up. All because a retired social studies teacher refused to let a bully with a loophole have the last word. So here's the question for you. Have you ever faced an HOA that treated covenants like a weapon? A neighbor who decided the rules didn't apply to them, someone who thought a title, a bank account, or a lawyer on retainer put them above the law? Drop your story in the comments. Let's build a record of what happens when regular people fight back and win, because this channel is about exactly that. The little guy outsmarting the machine. Stories with receipts where the good guys don't just survive, they plant new forests. If that sounds like something you want to see more of, hit subscribe. Next week, I'm covering a city council that denied a family's business permit because they didn't like the color of the sign. That family found a bylaw from 1892 that made them untouchable. You'll want to see how that ended. Until then, remember what Andrew Keller did. Document everything, keep your records, and never, ever let the bastards cut down your tree.